All right, so I want to move to talk a little bit more about why people are prejudiced. It's something we sort of touched on toward the end of the group processes lectures, where we talked about some social explanations for why people might engage in intergroup conflict, right? We talked about realistic group conflict theory as this general set of ideas that hostility between groups comes from scarce resources. And if groups are in conflict over resources, then they're going to be more prejudiced toward one another. But you can reduce those types of things by trying to lead groups to act in the interests of both sides and cooperate and work towards common goals. But we also noted how realistic group conflict theory doesn't explain quite enough about intergroup conflict, right? That conflicts still arise even when there are no resource scarcities, so there is more to be explained. One explanation that we talked about that touches on this is how we have these really important aspects of ourself that are tied to our groups, these social identities, that we define ourselves in terms of our group attachments, and we try to maximize our self-esteem by making positive comparisons to other groups. So we want to seem good in comparison to other groups. We're driven to see our groups as better than others to kind of maintain this positive reflection, and that can lead to intergroup hostility because of the way that we prioritize our own groups and derogate and withhold things from outgroups. But there are other reasons, of course, that people might be prejudiced, and in this class in social psych, we tend to think about situational explanations and things about the self and identity, but there are some important individual differences or personality level explanations and explanations that come from evolutionary psychology that I think are very useful to go through. So I want to talk about three different individual differences, or you might call them personality measures, that explain quite a bit of variance in terms of how prejudiced people might be. The first of these is authoritarianism. It's a term that, seemed kind of obscure to everybody besides social psychologists until about 4 or 5 years ago, but it's been used to explain a lot of political behavior in Europe and the United States in the last few years. But just in case you're not, you probably don't know a ton about the history of it, but authoritarianism has a lot to do with how people react to authority, not just explaining that people, what they do in positions of power or something like that. So people that are authoritarian, we know from research, tend to be people that have been raised in an environment where obedience is emphasized to be very important. So authoritarian people tend to be very deferent or submissive to authority, and they tend to be very deferential and adherent to the norms in their particular environment. So whether that's at a national level or things that are going on in your religion or your family, you tend to want to have things maintained the way they are, stay traditional, you want to know what the rules are and be able to stick by them, and any violation of those types of norms or rules to authoritarians tends to be very threatening. So people from, an outside group that might try to, join or infiltrate your group, as an authoritarian, you'd be very threatened by that. So it should probably come as no surprise from that description that people who are authoritarian tend to be more prejudicial in some respects. The example that might have come to mind for you might be like immigrant groups, right? That every country or area has their own norms, their own identities, and people that are coming in from outside of those areas to authoritarians are very threatening because they are violating something about the way of life in that area, or so it seems. So authoritarians tend to be people who are very hostile to outgroups. They're very hostile to people who violate traditional or conventional values or norms. And authoritarians tend to have more well-formed or kind of impactful stereotypes, and they also tend to be people that are kind of inflexible. And this kind of goes along with the idea that, you know, you're sticking with the rules that you understand, you don't want to violate them, you don't want other people to violate them. That sort of violation threatens you. You know, if you're authoritarian, you tend to be relatively inflexible in any number of ways. Authoritarianism is an idea that's been around for a very long time, so I just want to briefly talk about how it's measured, just because I think it's kind of interesting. Like a lot of things in this class, authoritarianism was something that was inspired by the awful events around World War II and the Holocaust. A group of social scientists, some of whom were Jewish, were interested in studying how somebody could, you know, do the things that that Nazis did around World War II, and they developed a scale to measure what they were calling authoritarianism that they called the F scale, F for fascist. So the fascist scale measured, you know, how much of a Nazi you could be, basically, and it had, you know, some problems measurement-wise. Obviously, it was kind of stuck in time in a sense because it was measuring fascism in a very specific sense, and fascism and authoritarianism, of course, are not exactly the same thing. But then, you know, it started off a long research tradition of measuring authoritarianism. Eventually, a researcher named Robert Altemeyer changed the scale a little bit. He developed it a little bit further and started calling it right-wing authoritarianism, partly because that's where he was observing it more often, partly because that's how he conceptualized it. But that's also kind of an incomplete way to think about authoritarianism, because of course, you know, he meant right wing in the like political, more conservative, traditional minded sense. But there are, even though, you know, you tend to think of the left as more open and progressive, there are authoritarians on the left too, right? You know, you could think about people that are like extreme on the left, and they might be cognitively inflexible in the sense that they deny anything that is not like an enormous change, or deny anything that deviates from their view. You can have very strong norms, whether you're liberal or conservative. So although authoritarianism does tend to be related to conservatism, there definitely are liberal or left-wing authoritarians. So a more recent way to measure authoritarianism is to do something that's kind of unconventional. I mentioned on the last slide how people that are authoritarian tend to be people raised in more obedience-focused households. And no coincidence, people that are authoritarian also tend to really value things like obedience and rigidity in children that they are raising, or even hypothetically raising. So to kind of get around some of the measurement problems with authoritarianism and sort of keep people from guessing what you're trying to measure, basically, because these things were, you know, kind of obvious when they're asking about fascism and, you know, things that have to do with right-wing ideals. Anymore, political scientists and psychologists tend to instead measure authoritarianism using 4 items that look something like this. They give you the choice, which is the more important value to instill in your child, or, you know, hypothetical child. And people choose between independence or respect for elders, obedience or self-reliance, curiosity or good manners, and being considerate or being well-behaved. And the bolded ones that I have there are the ones that are more related to authoritarianism. So if you selected all 4 of those, you would be relatively high on the authoritarianism scale. And if you selected all the ones that are not bold, you'd be relatively low on that scale. I'm going to circle back to talk a little bit more about authoritarianism after I talk about this other measure. But just know that, you know, authoritarianism is about rigidity and being threatened by things from the outside, and it has a lot to do with prejudicial attitudes. Another sort of complementary idea that's a little bit more recent in its development, but still explains a lot, is an idea called social dominance orientation. This is an idea developed by Jim Sedanius and Felicia Prado, two researchers at UCLA at the time. They're elsewhere now. But they developed this set of ideas as really a preference for inequality or group-based dominance in intergroup relations. So I have this worded in a kind of confusing way here. But the range of the scale of social dominance orientation goes from a preference for inequality up to a preference for inequality, which would be a high social dominance orientation, that you prefer inequality because you think some groups are better than others and deserve to dominate the other groups. So this is a scale or an idea that's a little more explicitly saying that some groups belong above others, and there should be conflict in the sense that one group should dominate another and have power over those other groups. So some of the items that are used to measure social dominance orientation, just to give you an idea. Some groups of people are simply inferior to other groups. If you endorse that, you would be higher in social dominance orientation. To get ahead in life, it's sometimes necessary to step on other groups. So again, you agree with that, it would be higher in SDO. And it's good to have reverse-coded items in your scales sometimes, or frequently, so people are not just kind of saying the same number and getting a high score or something. So a reverse-coded item that if you disagreed with it, you would tend to be higher in social dominance orientation. We would have fewer problems if we treated more people equally. So you can see how these all kind of fit together into this idea that, group-based inequality is, desirable or not. So maybe unsurprisingly, right, people that are high in SDO, they want to maintain differences between groups, and they want to even increase them because they believe that the differences between groups are valid and reasonable. And this, unsurprisingly, tends to be pretty related to prejudice, because that's how you sort of maintain these differences. You have to have these legitimizing myths that enhance the differences between hierarchies, and some of those myths are about the inferiority of some groups, right? That some groups are biologically inferior or intellectually inferior to others, and they don't belong in high status places, or they don't deserve prosperity or something. Would be kind of an ethos around SDO. So I mentioned how I was going to circle back to authoritarianism because SDO and authoritarianism actually tend to be similar in the sense that they both seem to come from your early worldviews that you develop. So early in your life, you are having lots and lots of different experiences that are influencing the way you see the world. Some of this is kind of biological and how you react to things, but some of it tends to come from experience. So if you are somebody who, experiences a lot of scarcity, particularly early in life, you might be more likely to develop the ethos that the world is some kind of competitive jungle, right? Or if you encounter a lot of danger early in life, you might be somebody that develops the idea that the world is a dangerous place. So these really kind of straightforward value systems that might develop, that the world is competitive or the world is dangerous, they tend to lead to these different ideas I just talked about. That if you have these competitive, scarce experiences early in life, you are going to tend to be somebody that has higher levels of social dominance orientation and believes that some groups, deserve to be on top and some groups deserve to be on the bottom. If you have a lot of threats in your world when you're younger, that's going to lead to more authoritarianism as kind of a reaction to the scariness of the world. That if you have norms to adhere to, if you have an authority figure that can tell you what to do and protect you, that's what authoritarians like, and that's what's going to protect you from the dangerous things out there in the scary world. So these things are, again, they're very distinct. They have a lot in common, But they also have some notable differences here, even though they both come from kind of similar developments in how worldviews come about relatively early in life and lead to these more complex ideologies later on. One last individual difference that I want to mention is an idea that two researchers, John Jost and one of his advisors, Mahzarin Banaji, came up with while John Jost was in grad school, and they came up with this, but it's been something he's been studying for the better part of 3 decades at this point. Something that they called system justification. So this is a general set of psychological processes, but they also have a system justification scale that measures how much of a system justifier you are, basically, in different domains. So system justification simply is the process by which existing social arrangements are legitimized, even at the expense of personal and group interest. So maybe put even a little more simply, it is how we rationalize the way things are. In the world, things tend to not always be 100% fair, right? Sometimes they're really unfair, sometimes they're just a little problematic, but things frequently are not totally fair. But we accept it to some degree, right? Maybe you don't accept it very much, but, we're not all constantly railing against the system. And part of the reason why is because we all are engaging in this process of justifying the system, saying, well, these social arrangements exist, there must be some reason, even if I don't know what it is, the social order must be the way it is for some reason. And, generally we're not going through this in an explicit process like this, but it is the general way that these things might come about. So this has a lot to do with cognitive dissonance theory, which should sound familiar, that we, the idea is here that it's a lot of work to feel bad about how the world is all the time. So maybe you just ignore it, or you reduce that dissonance by saying, no, things are, they should be the way they are, or if they're the way they are, then they must be natural, or whatever, and you just kind of accept it, basically. Or they also have a lot to do with the idea that, people have varying degrees to which they believe the world is just and right. So if you are somebody who believes the world is very just, you might also be a high system justifier. And if your group is an advantage group, certainly, social identity theory helps explain this because you think your group is great, and if your group is privileged and has a lot of capital and is on top of the hierarchy, then you can say, great, my group is awesome. Of course, this is why the world is the way it is, because my group is so deserving and wonderful. But system justification also, helps us feel better because we can't worry about everything going on all the time in the world. So it serves as kind of stress buffering function to kind of let us just deal with an unjust world. But the downside of that is that we will prop up unfair social systems and will be much more likely to rely on stereotypes to kind of make sense of the world. And again, I mentioned that system justification, it is an individual difference. There are people that are high and low in system justification. And one of the scarier things about this process is that if you are high in system justification, you just kind of accept these things even when they're unfair, and even when your own group is disadvantaged. So if you're in a minority group that is discriminated against, or is in a low status group of some kind, it might be kind of an adaptive thing for you to be a system justifier and be able to say, no, things are the way they are, my group doesn't deserve X, Y, and Z. And it, might lead to, inaction in some ways, and people not trying to get social justice outcomes for themselves because they are kind of convinced they don't deserve it because, things must be fair because they are the way they are, right? So, kind of kind of a downer of an idea, but it does explain quite a bit about people's reactions to unjust systems, whether they're on top of them or suffering near the bottom of some kind of social hierarchy. Okay, so I mentioned that I wanted to talk a bit about evolutionary explanations too, after we got through those more individual difference focused explanations. So the kind of big question here might be, is being biased against other groups, is being racist or ethnocentrist or whatever, are those types of reactions adaptive in some way? And the short, sad kind of answer to this tends to be yes. Intergroup bias is adaptive in the sense that you're prioritizing your own group. You are not prioritizing the needs of others because, human beings thrived because in our ancestral environment, we had group unity. We were able to cooperate with people that we knew and accomplish things, and we needed to be able to protect ourselves from other groups and detect, cheating from outside of our group. But it is more complicated than that in the sense that, yes, intergroup bias is adaptive, but it was adaptive in an environment that no longer exists, right? It doesn't mean that intergroup bias and being racist or xenophobic or whatever it happens to be always leads to good outcomes, particularly in our modern context. Our cognitive hardware, so to speak, is designed for a world that doesn't exist anymore, 60,000 years ago or more. And when we live our lives out in the modern world, then things tend to be a little bit mismatched. So, but if we do think about the ancestral environment, there were specific things we can point to that help us understand why it might have been useful to be prejudiced. If you were kind of dismissive of other groups or biased against other groups, it probably decreased the likelihood that you would get cheated by those other groups that would take something from you or not pay back some kind of favor. It helped keep integrity for your groups, like keep your groups cohesive and together and cooperating. And it probably was adaptive to, exploit groups that were not as equipped. So being able to kind of rationalize that and take advantage of other groups was probably a useful thing when groups were small and resources were more scarce. One painfully relevant one right now happens to be the idea that in the ancestral environment, you almost never came into contact with people that were not in your immediate group, so you had all of the same sorts of antibodies to the same types of pathogens that people you lived with and around did. And if you came into contact with other groups, they had probably different pathogens with them that you did not have antibodies to. So coming in contact with people that sounded or looked different from you might have been a health risk in that they might have a disease that you did not have an immunity to. So there's an argument that we, part of our behavioral immune system, so to speak, is that we have prejudicial reactions to people that seem different from us or foreign to us to try to stay healthy. Now, whether that is a useful thing in the modern environment is debatable, and the answer is probably not really, but it made more sense thousands of years ago when conditions were a little bit different. So all these types of things together, there seem to be some good reasons to think that we evolved literally to be prejudiced toward other groups. Again, I've talked about this a couple times in this class, but it's important to bring up that kind of naturalistic fallacy again, the difference between what is and what ought to be. Because we did adapt to be prejudiced, does it mean we should be prejudiced and it's right to be prejudiced? Well, no, of course not. And all these things together, they might seem like they justify certain sorts of behaviors or biases, but that's clearly not what I'm trying to say. But if you hear these things, you might kind of have the fear or the question, So we all evolved to be, racist. And I have a study that mentioned that I think kind of helps answer that question. By Chris Bantubi and Cosmides. This is a really interesting study where they were trying to look at the basis of our prejudice, basically. And their main argument was that the categorization abilities that we have, they didn't evolve to be specific to race. So when we were evolving, we're still evolving, but for the vast amount of human history, we didn't travel far enough to really encounter people of other races. We only saw people who had the same skin color as us, whatever it happened to be, usually darker. So we could not have evolved to be racist because we just haven't encountered people of other races for long enough in our history for that evolution to have happened. But we did evolve to categorize. The thing that we did probably evolve to categorize most was what indicated foreignness better in those times, which would have been the different languages that people spoke. That would have been an indicator that that person is from a different group. But even, categorizing people by language, what you're really trying to categorize there is what coalitions are existing, what groups are there. So we didn't evolve to categorize people by race. We evolved to detect these types of coalitional alliances. So who is cooperating with who? So Chris Bantubi and Cosmides, they did this study where they had people, kind of seems silly, but categorizing people by these different types of cues. And when they let people categorize by race versus when they gave them another very simple cue, people were very adaptive in the sense that they categorized more by the different colored basketball jersey people had than by race. So the study is more complicated than that. I know this sounds, maybe a little hokey as I explain it, but their evidence is very convincing if you look through their whole paper. But if we are this flexible in how we categorize people, and race really isn't that, important to our cognitive architecture of how we categorize people, the idea that race really matters in our current environment, social climate, and political climate, I'm not saying race doesn't matter, but I am trying to point out that we are not evolved to be racist. Race is as I've said several times, a social construct that we use to put on to different skin tones. It's not a biological reality, and it's definitely not an evolutionary reality to be racist. So I am going to stop this one here and start the next one talking a little bit about shooter bias.